By the early 1930s, the world was already beginning to change. Faith in parliamentary democracy and free markets had collapsed, as large numbers of people began to seek order, authority, and direction on the extremes of politics. This led to a reshaping, ultimately pushing the world towards the most destructive war in history. The economic boom of the 1920s in the USA had been built on fragile foundations, sustained by easy credit and the widespread belief that prosperity would go on forever. Millions borrowed to buy shares, mortgaging their futures on the prospect of the American dream. But on the 24th of October 1929, this bubble burst, with panic sweeping Wall Street, with unemployment, poverty, and a huge global trade slump soon following, as the Wall Street crash turned into the Great Depression. After the war, massive American loans had underpinned Europe's recovery, and these were soon recalled. As the crisis deepened, governments turned inwards, raising tariffs, restricting foreign labor, and tightly controlling capital to protect national economies. Faced with economic collapse, many governments clung to orthodox economic thinking. Balanced budgets, spending cuts, and wage reductions were imposed in the vain attempt to protect currencies tied to the gold standard. But the result was not recovery, but rather collapse. Bread queues, soup kitchens, and makeshift shanty towns became ubiquitous, while governments appeared powerless to offer solutions. In the USA, President Hoover initially responded cautiously, although his moratorium on reparations and war debts offered some relief. But it was not until after Franklin D. Roosevelt's election in 1932 that marked a decisive shift in approach was to be seen. Roosevelt rejected the orthodoxy, instead embracing large-scale public spending to stimulate employment, declaring that, quote, "The only thing we had to fear is fear itself." A wide range of alphabet agencies and public works programs followed, restoring confidence, even if recovery remained elusive for much of the decade. An academic explanation of this new style of economic government intervention was given by the Cambridge economist John Maynard Keynes in 1936, when he published The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money to great acclaim. The USA faced the Dust Bowl at the same time, an environmental disaster that compounded the hardship of the Depression. Years of over-farming, combined with severe drought, stripped the Great Plains of topsoil, turning vast areas into dust, forcing hundreds and thousands of people to abandon their homes. The final mortal blow to the international financial system that had already seen the American stock market lose around 90% of its value and world trade shrink by two-thirds came in May 1931 with the collapse of Credit Anstalt, Austria's largest private bank. This triggered a financial panic across Central and Eastern Europe so severe that 11 nations were forced to freeze assets and abandon the gold standard. This was the wreckage of the old order, further undermining confidence in liberal democracy and capitalism, creating even more space for radical political alternatives. Nowhere did the consequences of economic collapse prove more dangerous than in Germany, where political systems were already weakened by defeat in the First World War. By 1932, the Weimar Republic was paralyzed, widely associated with inflation, instability, and national humiliation, with 6 million unemployed and political violence a regular feature of daily life. As economic misery deepened, extremist parties on both the left and the right flourished. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis led by Adolf Hitler, presented themselves not as revolutionaries, but as a force of national renewal, order, and recovery. Their message resonated with millions who had lost faith in parliamentary politics and increasingly associated democracy with weakness, division, and decline. In January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, one of only 3 Nazis in a cabinet of 12. Vice-Chancellor von Papen persuaded President Hindenburg that Hitler could be controlled, believing himself to be the puppet master. Instead of seizing power through violence, however, Hitler exploited the legal framework of the Weimar Constitution to dismantle democracy from within. Following the Reichstag fire, he secured the Enabling Act of March 1933, which suspended civil liberties and effectively created a one-party state. By the end of that same month, Germany's first concentration camp at Dachau, near Munich in Bavaria, was opened. While much of the West remained trapped in the stagnation of depression, the Nazi regime used rearmament and public works to project an image of strength, stability, and restored national pride, epitomized so strongly by the glittering magnificence of the gaudy Berlin Olympics of 1936. While capitalist economies struggled and Germany appeared to have found an alternative to liberal democracy, the Soviet Union seemed largely insulated from the Great Depression. Under Joseph Stalin, the state pursued rapid industrialization through the brutal 5-year plans, aimed at achieving parity with the West within a decade. This drive was matched by forced collectivization of agriculture, which destroyed peasant livelihoods and triggered catastrophic famine, most devastatingly in the Ukraine. Steel production quadrupled, but the human cost ran into the millions through starvation, repression, and mass deportation. At the same time, the Gulag system expanded, using forced labor on a vast scale to build railways, canals, and other industrial projects. Between 1936 and 1939, Stalin also consolidated his position through the Great Purges. This led to the trial and execution of over half the delegates who had attended the Communist Party Congress in 1934, and over 70% of the members elected to the party's Central Committee of the same year. 8 generals who had served since the Civil War were shot in 1937, as were all the serving admirals in the Soviet Navy. Over half of the Red Army's middle-ranking officers were arrested at some time in the period up to 1939. To the world in crisis, the Soviet Union appeared to offer a grim alternative: total transformation enforced through absolute state control. The failure of democracy and capitalism at home was matched by the failure of collective security abroad. In the Far East, Japan invaded Manchuria in northeastern China in 1931, driven by economic pressures and a belief that territorial expansion was essential to national survival. The League of Nations condemned this aggression, with the Lytton Commission's long investigation confirming Japanese responsibility. Japan responded simply by remaining in Manchuria, with its withdrawal from the League a further nail in the coffin of collective responsibility. Manchuria exposed the weakness of collective security and sent a clear message to other revisionist powers that international law would not be defended by force and had no teeth. In China, the depression intensified existing instability rather than creating it. Early in the 1930s, Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party survived nationalist campaigns through the Long March. In 1935, the international community and the League of Nations were once again challenged when Benito Mussolini ordered the invasion of Abyssinia, seeking empire and prestige for fascist Italy. The attack represented a direct challenge to the principle of collective security once again, with the League imposing sanctions, although these were limited, inconsistently applied, and weak. In response, Britain and France were reluctant to confront Italy directly over Abyssinia in any meaningful way, having just met with Mussolini in the Italian town of Stresa earlier in the year, in April 1935. The Stresa Conference had issued a strong condemnation of Hitler's actions, and by guaranteeing the borders of Europe agreed in 1919, attempted to present a common front against further German aggression. It was hoped that this strong and united front would allow them to challenge Hitler's belligerence and get him to the negotiating table so that they could see what he wanted. Meanwhile, in Spain, as Soviet aid to the Republicans declined after 1937, nationalist forces steadily gained the upper hand. The conflict was marked by extreme brutality and aerial bombardment, none more infamous than the destruction of Guernica, later immortalized in the painting by Pablo Picasso. Spain had become Europe's first true battleground of left and right, exposing the inability of the liberal centre to respond effectively. By the end of 1938, nationalist advances had split Republican Spain in two, and the fall of Barcelona and Madrid in early 1939 brought the war to an end. At the same time, Britain entered the era of appeasement amid domestic instability caused by the abdication of Edward VIII. The crisis weakened confidence in leadership and undermined Britain's international authority as fascist aggression advanced in Abyssinia, Spain, and the Rhineland. Under Neville Chamberlain, appeasement developed from a conviction that another general war, only a generation after the last, must be avoided, and that the dictators could be reasoned with. Many in Britain accepted that the Treaty of Versailles required revision and admired the apparent economic revival of Hitler's Germany. Appeasement thus rested on the hope that compromise could secure stability and that Hitler could be satiated. But all the while, as Nazi negotiators protested that Germany just wanted its just desserts, after the penal restrictions of Versailles, their leadership gathered, planning for an expansionist war in the East to secure Lebensraum, living space, for the German people. These plans for war were confirmed at a meeting between Hitler and his senior military advisors in November 1937. The minutes of this meeting, later found by Allied archivists after the war, were recorded by one of Hitler's military aides, Colonel Friedrich Hossbach, and have come to be known as the Hossbach Memorandum. The memorandum clearly confirmed that plans for a war of expansion in the East would not be possible until 1914. In the meantime, he was happy to use the naivety of the appeasers to take what he could without firing a shot. By the mid-1930s, liberal democracy was already in retreat across much of the world, with economic collapse, social polarization, and the memory of the First World War weakening the resolve of democratic governments. In contrast, new authoritarian regimes across Europe promised order, employment, and national renewal. And by 1938, 14 of the democracies created in Paris after the First World War had fallen to tyranny. Thus, a road to ideological and geopolitical Armageddon had been opened, and it seemed a second Great War was becoming more and more likely.